Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Matthew Alford, and he published a book in 2017 titled National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. An excellent book, which I've read in its entirety. Now in the US, it has 58 five-star ratings. And Mr. Alford is a teaching fellow at the University of Bath in England. His doctoral thesis applied Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model to the contemporary Hollywood film industry. His first book is Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy. It was published in 2010 and has been translated into Chinese. And in 2014, Matthew Alford produced a documentary film of his research titled The Writer with No Hands, which premiered at Hot Docs in Toronto and won the Tablet of Honor at the Amar Popular Film Festival in Tehran, in Iran. And he co-wrote this book with Tom Secker. I came across his name. I was looking through a friend of mine at Mysterious Radio, K-Town, and I saw his name, and it looked like a great fit for my show. So I was delighted to read the book and have him on. So Matthew Alford, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thanks very much for that nice introduction, William. Good to be here.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard your background, I know you have a project that's coming out very shortly. Can you kind of talk about your academic career and what led you up to writing this book, National Security Cinema?
So I got interested in international relations, British and American foreign policy when I was young. And I was aware of Noam Chomsky's work, for example, on the propaganda model. And I was just generally interested in deception, I guess, deception and war and violence and those kind of areas. And I realized that the work by academics had been done reasonably well on how propaganda comes through the news. That had been covered by lots of people. But not very many people had really engaged in Hollywood as a system of representing American power. How do films represent American foreign policy? Do they represent American foreign policy in a positive way, in a negative way? And all the work on that was pretty sparse or even absent. So that's how I got into it. I applied Noam Chomsky's propaganda model to Hollywood, and then subsequently, I got into I guess I probably would have given up after doing that, because that was kind of, you see what I mean? That was kind of a project in itself, and that was done. And I sort of found I surveyed over 100 films for my first book and my early projects to look at how they represented American foreign policy. And it was pretty clear that even the most critical films were actually pretty supportive of fundamental aspects of American foreign policy. And I kind of would have left it there. And I never got work as a researcher or anything like that within universities. And so I kind of was going to drop it. But then I met Tom Secker. And Tom is this relentless bulldog of a Freedom of Information Act requester. And we sort of inspired each other to send in a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests to actually get the documentation that demonstrates how the system itself, how the government, the White House, but particularly the Department of Defense and the CIA are involved in rewriting films. And we got a sudden huge boon of information around about 2014, 15. Hi, Lee. Thanks. I'm glad that you're looking forward to it. We got this sudden huge influx of information in 2014, 15, which demonstrated that the role of the CIA and, well, particularly the Department of Defense was dwarfed what anyone had previously known. And it was a surprise to us. Hence the rather cheesy subtitle to our book, which I'd never normally put, but the shocking.
But it's very fitting. Sorry to interrupt, but it's very fitting because a lot of this information isn't accessible. You can't just go ask for these contracts or some of these documents. You mentioned one guy who's done a lot of research, but this is usually not for public purview, right?
Well, no, I mean it's not like it's stamped top secret, but it's like with a lot of the most effective way to keep things secret is often to have them declassified or have them in the public domain, but just have them presented in a very boring manner. I had a similar thing with go into US foreign policy planning documentation. It's all really tedious, but it's also terrifying if you actually pick it out. It's the same thing. I interviewed a guy called TJ Coles about British foreign policy, and you know he's just absolutely petrified by what Britain has done around the world. But all he's using is open source documentation, but from websites, from documentation from the British government that's just so boringly laid out there in kind of in its stark psychopathic detail that no one bothers to read it. And he was just one of the few people who actually bothered to read this kind of bureaucratic, technocratic, brutal worldviews of these policy planners. It's the same thing with the PR machine that's behind what the Pentagon and these other organizations, these national security organizations, are doing in Hollywood. You know, that they're just doing their job and blithely doing this. But to clarify, but to more directly answer your question, yeah, it is true that they don't put that out unless you request it. And so for many decades, this information was kept in a dusty old library until we were able to find ways around that a few years ago to unlock that key. It was basically kept for this information for about 40 years by one historian who died about 2 or 3 years ago, and the whole edifice of this kind of disinformation machine has come tumbling down since.
And that's how far back it goes, is to World War II. I think you mentioned the document that film as a psychological warfare. So it goes back there to World War II and post-war kind of manipulation of film in the States particularly, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it goes back a little bit before that in the sense that, you know, Hollywood worked with the military as far back as the turn of the 20th century. I mean, like the Spanish-American War, you know, the first propaganda film that was ever made was the Spanish flag coming down a flagpole and the American flag going up the flagpole. It was about 15 seconds long. You can find it on YouTube. You know, that's the first propaganda film. And then subsequently, there were films like Birth of a Nation, which you may well know is a horrendously racist Ku Klux Klan supporting film from 1915 that had support of the National Guard. But it was really just after World War II, you completely accurately saying, just after World War II, that this relationship between the military and indeed the whole military industrial complex became formalized with Hollywood. Even then, it was nothing like as extensive as it has been over the last 20 years. The last 20 years, things have just blown up is an unfortunate choice of terms for what's happening at the moment.
Coinciding with the American national security policy, foreign, international policy. So very interesting.
Yeah, so it's really accelerated considerably since 9/11 and since both the Department of Defense and the CIA decided to work much more with network television around about 2004, 2005. But there have been various points over time where the national security organizations have realized that they need to accelerate what they're doing. One of those times was in the mid-1970s because the CIA had got such a bad rap for what it was doing, the assassination committees and all that kind of thing. And they realized that they needed to up their PR game rather than just trying to close everything down all the time. And another time was in the mid-1980s after the phenomenal success of Top Gun, the Tom Cruise film, when all the agencies, but particularly the CIA and Department of Defense, realized, wow, we didn't realize how inspiring we could be just with a movie. And so at all these different points in history, there's been a sudden kickstarting of or an acceleration of what these PR organizations have wanted to do. And indeed, just after the end of the Cold War as well, similar thing. And that was partly because a lot of these organizations, particularly the CIA, realized that they weren't really needed as much anymore. because they didn't have a Soviet threat. So they put more and more attention into PR and more attention into entertainment. So there's been various points at which there's been an acceleration of interest in this kind of public communication, and it's never drifted back at any point. It's just kept accelerating.
Right. No, it is remarkable. And it goes back there. You were some terms in your book in the earlier part that I'd never heard before. What an ELO is, an entertainment liaison offices, and these production assistance agreements. Can you talk about how the mechanics kind of take place in the kind of background?
So the ELO is an entertainment liaison officer, and now these days, all of the government organizations have some kind of ELO. That includes the FBI, Homeland Security, all the police departments have an equivalent as well, have an entertainment liaison officer if they're big enough. And of course, the Department of Defense. And basically, they are just a human being who may or may not have previously served in that institution, who works with, communicates with the entertainment industry, particularly Hollywood and network television, to create projects that are in the interests of that institution. The CIA got its first ELO in the mid 1990s. Previously, it didn't have an ELO. So for the 40 years prior to that, basically the CIA was most of the time just trying to crush projects that might be critical of it. And certainly for the first sort of 13 years of its existence, it was extraordinarily effective at doing that, even without an entertainment liaison officer. It wasn't even the acronym CIA was not mentioned in Hollywood movies until around about 1960, because the CIA was so effective at preventing it from getting into public currency. And essentially the producers will come to the ELOs, to the ELO offices, and say, we want some assistance. We need some Black Hawk helicopters. We need an aircraft carrier, whatever it is. We need some advice, maybe. And can you assist us on it? And then the military or whatever organization it is will take the whole script, go through it, and say, we need you to change these parts. In a way, some people find it shocking. I don't know what your view of it is, William. How sort of bad do you think that is? It's if you were running a PR organization, you'd do exactly the same thing. If I was running an advertising agency, I'd do exactly the same thing. And in a way, this doesn't mean that these people are singularly terrible people or terrible institutions. The problem is they are extraordinarily powerful. They are not selling toothpaste. They're not selling burgers, which would be perhaps bad enough. But they are presiding over the most powerful weapons and political systems on the planet. So this is why we need to be extremely careful with the way that political communication happens. And unfortunately, the great powers are not careful with that at all. Of course, the United States being the most egregious offender. And the changes that they make are really extensive to the scripts. That was one of the things that had been sort of concealed over that many decades. Was the extent of the politicization of those changes, but they really are quite extensive. And
you used an example of like E. Howard Hunt going in. He's negotiating with Orwell's wife, but they turned it into they made sure that anti-communist theme was there at the end. So that's like one example of a lot of myriad, and it's a tit for tat, right? They're negotiating for the use of these military products or whatever, pictures of the CIA, but they want something in return. And
yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't make it to the public. Public doesn't know that they're being propagandized.
No, I mean, the public doesn't know. I mean, like there is technically, we are both in democratic society, so there is there are mechanisms that mean that that a handful of people can eventually find out how the state is manipulating what's on television. So that those mechanisms are there, but I mean, to what end? I mean, we've been publicizing this information for many years, but it obviously doesn't have any impact really on the ultimate output of the Hollywood system, of the entertainment system. So the fact that there is, the ability to technically find out some of this, a lot of the material, if you put in the right freedom of information request with the right keywords, it's kind of neither here nor there. You still live in a democracy, but how does that actually function?
Well, in the United States, the Munt Act allows the government to propagandize against their own people. So the totality, I've always thought that there's so many movies. You talked about many of the TV shows that they're really pro-American national security state. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I think that was the act from 2012, wasn't it? Which has further permitted the use of direct propaganda, including propagandizing the American public itself. So it's an extremely it's a massive problem. It's really a massive problem.
Right, and you talk about some of these friends, they're going through, like you talk about even the Bond films, the Transformer films. I thought an interesting fact was that the Transformer films were negotiating with the national security state before the screenplay was finished.
Yeah. Well, that's how good the relationship is between Michael Bay and the Department of Defense, as you've seen in the documentary that we've recently completed, which is called Theaters of War. Michael Bay says in that, I've got a direct line to the Pentagon. And indeed, he does.
That's him on the cover of the book too, right?
Isn't that it is actually, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. It's a lovely picture, that, isn't it?
Yeah. Very telling.
Yeah, but a lot of these producers do have very close relationships with the Department of Defense. Steven Spielberg was given an award by the Secretary of State for Defense under the Clinton administration, for example. But also people like Peter Berg as well, who did The Kingdom, and there are a kind of a group of kind of manly directors, if you want to put it like that, who are really very tied in direct tools of the state, of the militarized state. But in a way, it's not just that. It's not just the fact that there's this odd Top Gun film that's coming out or whatever. It's it's a much wider problem than that, and a worse problem than that, because it's just anyone who asks for any assistance at all from the military or CIA or some of the bigger police departments, FBI and so on. They just have their script shredded if they can't allow anything from it. So there are still some films that come out that are critical, but they're the ones that have that have made really quite conscious choices to not go through the system, and they're usually very small budget. They don't get very good distribution, and you still find good films out there, things like Kill the Messenger, for example, and various others. But it is and filmed by Oliver Stone, for example. But it's a tough ride for them.
Right. It's usually, you think it's the independent films that are the ones that are not attached, but like Transformers is a huge industry just to itself. Imagine the power of propaganda that comes through the back of these films. It's off the charts. The reach is really global.
Yeah, I mean, I think Transformers in a way is such a good example because it's such a huge example where there was such integration with the military. That said, I mean, the actual controversial content of Transformers is not as severe as some other products, because it's just about stupid robots. But yeah, I mean, it's all just watered down, government friendly. And this is part of the agreement that they sign, because it's not just a quid pro quo where it's kind of we'll give you an aircraft carrier if you help out, if you water down your script. They are contracted into this as well, and part of the agreement, and it's one of the bits of small print, is you mustn't malign the foreign policy of the United States, mustn't oppose the oppose government policy. So there have been innumerable films, and we know that there is we know that even just at the Marines, for example, they have said that there are boxes stacked up from floor to ceiling of scripts that have been rejected. We know some details about some of them. So, for example, there was a film about the Iran-Contra scandal, which is from the 1980s, that kind of came close to bringing down the Reagan administration. It was about illegal arms sales and drug running and so on. The real scandal. But they wouldn't make that film in 1994, even though it had Sigourney Weaver attached to it. It was called Countermeasures because it was going to be set on an aircraft carrier. So, on this occasion, they said very explicitly, which they probably shouldn't have done if they'd been being a bit more careful as PR people. They said, we have no reason to remind the public of the Iran-Contra scandal or to malign the White House. Now, usually they aren't so silly as to trip up and say such things, but this is obviously standard policy. But it's also written into the actual contract as well that mustn't be anything opposing American foreign policy.
Crazy. And I think you wrote that Oliver North created like a contending movie to try to subvert that movie. So
that was a really interesting revelation that came out a small story in the press 2 or 3 years ago where Oliver North from Iran-Contra fame had set up a rival bid for a film about Iran-Contra so that the people trying to make it could not win that bid. And then, of course, when Oliver North, who was operating behind a front company, won that, he then just buried the film. But Iran-Contra is one of those hot topic issues, in the past where the CIA and Department of Defense were extremely effective at clamping down on any of that. But the CIA and Department of Defense are very, very efficient at all sorts of things. This isn't just something in the past or particular or a small set of issues. It's a very wide range of issues. As you know, I think it sounds like you've read the book very carefully, but it's anything to do with drug taking in the military, for example, arms sales, bioweapons, anything to do with oil companies, any mention of oil companies, any mention of private armies, or is any mention of oil companies doing anything at all bad, anything to do with racism, anything where the government has done something bad in terms of race in the past, anything to do with coups, or certainly coups that relate to the real world, overthrowing of governments, anything that relates to governments being involved, US government being involved in assassinations, anything about the failure to prevent 9/11, all of these things go. Anything about sexual assault in the military. I mean, that's the way that they've approached that has been. I mean, it's all disgraceful, but it's kind of particularly sort of gross the way that they've done that. I mean, TV series like NCIS, as you probably saw as you may have seen in the film, they literally turn an entire episode around so that the victim of sexual assault is trying to cover up her own sexual assault. But the military are so good, the military brass are so good that they try to find out what has happened to her so that they can punish the perpetrator. I mean, that is whitewashing to the point of, I don't even know. It's beyond whitewashing.
It's a huge problem in the military.
And of course, like all forms of bullying and assault are a huge problem in the military.
Super brutal.
But the CIA, the Department of Defense has been extremely careful about that. It's less of an issue for the CIA. Although the CIA are very keen to. One of the reasons that the CIA got so involved in the 90s was because they wanted to have a lot more women and minorities in the to recruit. So that's one of the reasons that they had TV series like Alias, for example, with Jennifer Garner, where they were intimately tied in the production of that. In fact, Julia Garner even made an advert for the CIA unpaid.
That's right.
And so it was about creating, an attractive environment for women and minorities at CIA.
And her husband is like Affleck. Didn't he jokingly admit that he was an agent? Whether you believe that or not, is up to you.
Yeah, that was a British journalist. I think it was from the Guardian here in the UK. And they said, are you the CIA asset or whatever? And he was like, yeah, Yeah, I am, and now you've blown my cover. And he kind of was joking, but actually, Ben Affleck has worked. I mean, it depends how you define working with or asset of or whatever, but he has worked on a lot of films with intimate CIA support. In fact, it was only I think last year that I received Tom, my co-author Tom Secker, tends to put in the Freedom of Information Act requests rather than me, but I had one come through my door late 2020, I think it was. And I thought, I haven't put in a Freedom of Information Act request, but it was all the emails from Ben Affleck to the CIA for the film Argo. And I remember thinking, I don't understand why they're sending me this. And because I'd completely forgotten. It's because I hadn't actually, I had sent it. I'd sent in my request in 2012. So it had taken them over 8 years.
Wow, that's incredible.
So there's an indication again of the democracy thing. It's like, well, technically you can get the information if you want to wait to your old age.
Right. That's one of the biggest tricks in the book here in the States, is just keep it locked up and delay tactics. But Argo was very important. Wasn't that the one about the release of hostages in Tehran? So that made everybody look good. Ben Affleck. The one that I thought was really pure propaganda, I don't know if you know any background about that, but Ben Affleck in Pearl Harbor after 9/11. So 9/11 is the new Pearl Harbor. And then that movie drops, and it's like somebody, I think, very cleverly put those together in my mind. I don't have any of it.
I seem to remember that Pearl Harbor came out, I think, on the first week of September 2001, something like that. And I think I seem to remember that the studio, it was a very unpopular film. It was received very badly. Everyone thought it was a load of rubbish, and they're quite right. It was. But it was one of these cases where the studio pushed the film, even though there was no public demand for it. So there's this tendency, isn't there, for us in the West to think, well, the market will sort all this out, supply and demand. Well, actually, in that case, it was a really obvious example where the film was barely making money, but the studio artificially pushed it because they liked it. They liked the message that it was putting out to the public. If you had a real market where it wasn't up to studio executives to be pushing what they want, you'd have a very different media landscape. And it may not be a perfect media landscape, but it would be considerably more democratic and more varied and more interesting, more creative than what we currently have. I mean, the mainstream is awful. I know that everyone says that the mainstream is dead, but there is still a mainstream. There is still a mainstream where there is a ton of money pumped through that, and it's forced upon the public effectively. That's why one of the reasons why, slightly to go off entertainment, although I suppose it is a form of entertainment, sport. They found I think it was in the 80s and 90s, for example, that a lot of people weren't really watching golf, but golf was always put on the television because the richest people in the country wanted to watch it. There was no demand for it, but it was artificially imposed. In the same way that at least until 9/11, there was poor and limited coverage of foreign policy issues in US news, even though the public wanted it. All the opinion polls were saying the public demanded more details about foreign policy, but the system itself, the powerful people were saying, no, you don't need that. You don't need that. This isn't a problem with populations, not really. If we were just populations, we would have a relatively nice world and a relatively nice mediated system. It is the elites.
No question. Yeah, we don't get it in the United States. We don't get a choice on our foreign policy. It's left up to somebody else. So just like Ukraine and all this other stuff, but I'll be interested to see what kind of movies come out in the next couple of years, or documentaries having to do with what's going on right now in the world. But even like the cartoon movies, the DC comics and all, these are huge industries, but you're talking about also making sure that these certain themes are emphasized, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Marvel films in particular, it's just incredible. My co-author Tom Secker did a book that came out a couple of months ago, which is called "Superheroes, Movies, and the State," and that wasn't an area that I found out everything about it was him and another colleague of ours called Trisha Jenkins from Texas, who went into the details on DC's cooperation with the national security state and Marvel's cooperation. And Marvel in particular, most of their films are deeply integrated. In fact, Iron Man was a really good example. There's about 15 pages in Tom and Trisha's book, which basically details how the original script, Iron Man, plays this character who is really explicitly military industrial complex, anti-arms trade, and how that script over time was subverted so that it became essentially the Robert Downey Jr. character essentially became a kind of tool of the state, or at least working with the state in quite a militaristic position. And of course, that was work. That was one of those products that had full cooperation from the Department of Defense. I mean, I'm giving a snapshot here. It's worth getting the book, which is from 2017, although there was a French edition from 2020 that was slightly updated. But there's also Tom Secker's website is free, and you can get all the documentation on that. It's called spyculture.com.
I'll put that in the show notes, Spy Culture. I'll put a link to that.
It's a really good one. Tom's work is on. There's a couple of bits and pieces from me on there as well. But Spy Culture is free. And then Theatres of War will be. I think Theatres of War will be out for free for students and academics, I believe. And it should be any day now, but I keep saying that. It was completed at the turn of the year.
Can you talk about the genesis of that documentary, how you got Oliver Stone involved?
Oliver Stone contacted me, whatever it was, about a year ago, to say, partly to say that I don't think he really agreed with some of my viewpoints on what JFK had done, but he did really enjoy the book National Security Cinema. He thought that was brilliant, and he wasn't really aware of it. He wasn't really aware that this system had happened. I mean, he's had some rejection letters when he's asked for support from the military, for example. But generally speaking, he hasn't asked. When he made Snowden, for example, in 2016. He wasn't going to ask for the National Security Agency to support that film, or the military, or anyone. And in fact, that's a good example where he made a film. I think he had about 30 days to film it in, which is extremely tight timing. I think he had he had to miss the funeral of his own mother because even if you're a multimillionaire filmmaker, you can't just if you haven't got money behind you. You're making it effectively independently, even though if you're as big a name as that, you just can't do it. So anyway, he really liked the book, and we arranged for me to interview him in Los Angeles. Coronavirus got in the way, so the lead filmmaker, Roger Stahl from Atlanta, interviewed Oliver Stone in Los Angeles at his house there while I was stuck in an airport trying to argue that I should be allowed into America. And Oliver Stone was brilliant. Roger gave Oliver Stone the Roger dug up some of the rejection letters that Oliver Stone's team had from the 1980s, for example, which I don't think he'd even ever seen himself. And I think we were kind of expecting, and certainly Roger, I think, was expecting to meet Oliver Stone and be like, this is the guy who's going to break open the conspiracy for us. But actually, of course, in practice, Oliver Stone just didn't know. He didn't really know how the system was operating because he was kind of on the outside of it all from the start. So it wasn't like a kind of, meet Mr. X or meet the man with all the answers. It was, it was meeting an ex-military man who was an incredible filmmaker, and the research had to be done painstakingly, by our team. Sorry, I slightly went off the point there, but
no, you didn't. No, it's very important because he doesn't know, but we don't know either. The public doesn't know what's going on behind the screen. It's like the Wizard of Oz. The screen is a curtain.
It is. We did the we did the book, and then I think essentially Roger Stahl is a professor. I think this kind of galvanized him into making the documentary himself, and he's done an incredibly. He's worked a lot of times with an organization called MEF, which is Media Education Foundation, and they are a very kind of committed political distributor. And that's why they end up, I think, putting things out for free for educational. Well, I'm not sure if it's. I don't quite know how that works, but in any case, they're very good at working with universities in particular.
So the film is being distributed. It's just having trouble going from getting to that last step. Is that correct?
I've seen the final iteration of the film, which was a couple of months ago. I think because there was some filming that was done in Britain. Of me, for example, and some other bits and pieces. I think there was a formatting issue, which is just it's just taking a few weeks to sort out. That was not foreseen when the film was completed around about New Year.
Gotcha. And do you have, like, is it only going to stream, or how is it going to be distributed?
I believe it's going to be distributed on Canopy, which I think is a student thing in the States. And then I think it's going to be available for a relatively modest price, as far as I'm aware, through something else, like it will be YouTube or Vimeo or something like that. They haven't actually told me on that. I'm a co-producer on it, but they're doing the final bits now, and I don't want to bother them by asking this kind of thing right now.
But it is a full 90 minutes. Is there anything in there?
Really good, and yeah, they've really done a very, very good job on it. I think sorry, I'm advertising my own thing here.
No, that's what you're here to do. Please do.
Yeah, well, the thing I'd say is that Roger is a professor, and this is his research area. So I think he took this as the most huge research project he could possibly do to build on our work. And so actually, the book, I'm very proud of the book, but actually Roger has done a massive research project, I guess, to try and prove that his research is better than mine and Tom's, I always slightly think. But at the same time, he's really quite a good filmmaker. So he's, at the same time as doing a massive research project, he's also done this sort of very creatively put together filmmaking project as well. I'm surprised that he hasn't had a nervous breakdown, to be honest with you, because that is way too much work. He's been driving around the United States throughout 2019 and 20. So I think he was really galvanized into doing, I suspect, his magnus opus. But
right.
Yeah,
he's a PhD from Penn State. The most recent book is Through the Crosshairs: War, Visual Culture, and the Weaponized Gaze. So he's kind of, he has very similar outlook or interest as you, at least.
Yeah, very similar things going on. Yeah.
And I think it's important. I mean, that's the fundamental thing about your book is I've learned so much, but people are being exposed. They think they're going just to go get entertained, and they're getting a lot of other stuff, very subtle things that are committed and omitted, right? So it's not just the stuff that they put in, it's what they put in.
I mean, some of the most dramatic sort of things are, that idea of them being behind things to change narratives, to push out narratives. And that does happen all the time. But yeah, I mean, the less dramatic things, we'll just remove that. And that's what happens a lot of the time. So, for example, any time that the military is associated with anything bad, like we just talked about there, there was, a really good example would be on the film The Hulk, for example. And there was a Operation Angry Hand, Operation Ranch Hand, happened to be, which was the operation to capture the Hulk, a fictional green character in purple shorts. Operation Ranch Hand was happened to be the name of a chemical weapons defoliation program in Vietnam. And so the military said, no, we don't want that association whatsoever, even though it's just an accident. So they got them to remove that. It's a really obvious example. But that happens, just on a constant basis.
And we haven't even gotten into other parts of your book. You go into case studies, you cover Avatar, Black Hawk Down, Hotel
Yeah,
Rwanda.
and one of the things that really bugs me is that, which I haven't actually mentioned, is the which is particularly pertinent because of Ukraine, is the downplaying of nuclear threats, and that one particularly, won't swear live on your show, but it irritates me considerably. But they very specifically soft sell anything to do with nukes. Anything to do with the possibility of nukes going missing, like in that Christian Slater film Broken Arrow, which they wouldn't cooperate on for this reason. Even up to the Godzilla film, where there's simply a mention in the 2019 version of Godzilla, for example, they simply mention Hiroshima. And they get rid of it because they're like, no, we don't want that. And then as through turns on that, they effectively, but not effectively, they do make Godzilla. They turn the whole metaphor of what Godzilla is, which is a warning about the dangers of nuclear power, nuclear weapons. They turn Godzilla into something that is the savior of humanity, and the idea that nuclear weapons can be the savior of humanity. They do something similar in the Terminator films when they were completely just wrecked that series by their involvement in the third, but primarily in the fourth installment. So many of these changes are not just wrong morally. Some of it just in context it just turns your stomach. Really, it's just disgusting what they do. But
I mean, but I don't think a lot of Americans know what they're getting.
That's not American.
Yeah.
It's people around the world just don't know. We really did. We had a bit of luck. We did break a big story on this, a few years ago by having these documentations. Because the main thing was that there was this general consensus that there was just a couple of hundred, maybe a few hundred. That was around about 2000. The year 2000, that the consensus was that there were a couple of hundred films that had been affected maybe over time, but now we're looking at many thousands of hours. And actually, probably if you're going to involve some of the most controversial police forces in this as well, like the New York Police Department, LA Police Department, FBI, and so on, you're probably talking about more than 10,000 hours of television and movies. And that's not even to get into what they've done with computer games as well, which is not an area that we've particularly gone down the line. So by a factor of something like, the timing's slightly different, but we essentially found a few years ago that there was, by every measure that we could possibly measure, the effect of the national security state was something like 10 times larger than anyone had previously indicated.
Wow,
and probably that figure even now is probably lowballing it. So
wow, it's incredible. That's a great way to end it. Matthew, where's the best place for people to get national security cinema?
Well, unfortunately, it's Amazon. So please do go to Amazon, even though it's not the best company in the world. And please please do go to Tom Secker's site as well for spyculture.com. And also, and why not go on my Facebook, where I'm putting out a lot of information about warfare and entertainment of all sorts of different stripes, and that's called Facebook.com/The Writer with No Hands. And I post very regularly, The Writer with No Hands.
Writer with No Hands. Can you give the audience just a little background about your documentary, The Writer with No Hands? Because it's an unbelievable story.
It was a crazy story. So this was a Hollywood screenwriter in the late 90s, disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and he had just finished writing a screenplay. Thank you, Lee. He had just finished writing a screenplay about the US invasion of Panama in 1989, and the script went missing, never to be discovered. His car went missing, his whole body went missing, and it led to a huge manhunt for him. It was a crazy conspiracy that I think you'll find really interesting. I'm not quite sure how else to talk about that, but basically I ended up going to follow this cold case into Los Angeles and into the desert around there with a very unreliable cameraman.
I'm sorry to hear that, but I remember vaguely reading about that story, then the conclusion, it just was all very, very strange, but and surreal. But
There's,
I'd
a,
love
there's,
to.
there's a book of that as well called called The Writer with No Hands, which has been which I did a few years ago, more novel like.
And you wrote that? You wrote The Writer with No Hands? Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
For some reason, I didn't see that on Amazon. Anyway, I got to wrap it up. The author is Matthew Alford. Title of the book, full title is National Security Cinema: The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. And coming up is anytime now is his new documentary titled Theaters of War, featuring him, Oliver Stone. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
All right, cool.